What happens when the youngest voice from the White House walks into the lion's den? When smirks are weapons and applause is scripted? Karoline Leavitt didn't just enter Stephen Colbert's world, she rewrote the rules. The cameras panned across the studio as The Late Show with Stephen Colbert returned from its commercial break. Blue and crimson lights danced across the polished stage. The applause sign flickered below. The audience, largely liberal and ready for a spectacle, leaned in as Stephen Colbert, the reigning king of progressive late-night satire, stood to greet his next guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colbert said with a smirk, "please welcome someone who's braver than I am. She agreed to show up here tonight." The crowd laughed, some already smirking with anticipation. Former Trump White House Assistant Press Secretary and proud Gen Z Republican, Karoline Leavitt. She stepped onto the stage with a confidence that didn't match the audience's energy. Tailored blazer, heels that clicked with intention, and eyes that scanned the crowd without flinching. She shook Colbert's hand firmly and took her seat. The applause was polite, but scattered with murmurs. This wasn't her territory. Colbert leaned forward, already loading the first round. "So, Karoline," he said with theatrical friendliness, "you've gone from being the youngest mouthpiece for Trump to, what now, the spokesperson for outdated ideas and skinny jeans?" The crowd erupted. Caroline smiled calmly. "Well, Stephen, I suppose it depends on which ideas you think are outdated. Free speech, secure borders, balanced budgets. I'm happy to defend all three." Colbert raised an eyebrow. "Touché, but tell me, how does it feel to represent a generation that largely disagrees with you?" Caroline sat straighter. "It feels like being an independent thinker, something I hope your audience still respects." What was unfolding wasn't just another interview. It was a showdown between generations, ideologies, and communication styles. Colbert had built an empire on ridicule. Caroline had built a reputation on restraint and reason. But neither knew how much the balance was about to tip. Behind the scenes, this interview had been prepped with the same formula Colbert's team had used for years. Bring in a controversial conservative, ask loaded questions, go viral. His writers had clips ready to post before the interview even aired. But Caroline had prepared too. She had watched every conservative guest Colbert had interviewed in the past 5 years. She knew the rhythm: sarcasm, laughter, cornering, clip-worthy crash. But she also knew something else. Colbert rarely expected true composure. His success relied on the guests losing their footing. She didn't plan to give him that. Colbert grinned out. "But seriously, don't you ever wonder if maybe your youth is being used to make an old ideology seem new? A sort of political TikTok filter?" The audience laughed again, but not as loud. Caroline leaned in. "Actually, I think it's the opposite. I'm here because young Americans are smart enough to realize that flashy filters don't fix broken economies. I'm not the distraction. I'm the generation asking what went wrong and why our future costs more than our past." Colbert blinked. He wasn't expecting that level of precision. He tried again. "So you're saying Trumpism is the future?" "I'm saying that the future belongs to those who show up," Caroline replied. "And when I look at the economic hardship, censorship, and cultural hostility my generation faces, many of us are realizing that free markets and free speech aren't old ideas. They're the ideas we desperately need back." For the first time, murmurs in the crowd weren't dismissive. They were contemplative. Some viewers crossed their arms, others leaned forward. Colbert tapped his pen nervously on the desk. "Let's pivot," he said. "What was it like working in the Trump White House? I mean, aside from the usual chaos, were there any actual duties?" Another jab, but Caroline smiled. "My duties included briefing the press, coordinating messaging strategies, and making sure reporters understood the facts, not just the headlines and chaos. I'd say there's a lot more chaos now in our schools, our streets, and our border." The room went quiet. She had shifted the spotlight. Instead of defending herself, she put the current administration on the hot seat without ever mentioning names. It was classic rhetorical judo. Colbert blinked, regrouping. "So you're saying things were better under Trump?" "I'm saying," Caroline replied, "that Americans, including young Americans, deserve facts before feelings. And when facts are scary, sometimes people change the subject. But I'm here to stay on it." The audience didn't know whether to clap or sneer. Caroline looked directly into the camera. If we can't talk across lines, Stephen, then the only thing we're really protecting is our echo chambers. The screen faded to black as the show cut to commercial, but millions of viewers would still be watching, replaying her calm, her clarity, and her refusal to play by the script. What if the script fails? What if the sarcasm gets countered by sincerity and the joke lands flat? When Colbert leans in with all his rhetorical weight, he expects to crush. But tonight, Karoline Leavitt doesn't just resist, she reverses. The lights came up again after the break. Colbert shuffled his blue note cards theatrically, eyes glinting toward the camera. We're back with Karoline Leavitt, the Gen Z whisperer of the conservative world, he quipped. If you've just joined us, you've missed a whole lot of polite disagreement, laughter, a few cheers. Caroline smiled with professional ease, her hands calmly folded in her lap. She knew what was coming. The real blows hadn't yet begun. Colbert leaned in. Let's get serious, he said. You say you represent young Americans. But let's talk about the issues that matter. Climate change, reproductive rights, student loan forgiveness. These aren't political chess pieces. These are people's lives. How do you justify supporting policies that so many in your generation find regressive, even dangerous? Caroline responded without pause. By believing that real solutions matter more than slogans, Stephen. Take climate change. Yes, we care, but we also care about innovation. You can't shut down energy independence while pretending wind farms will magically power a global economy overnight. A small ripple in the crowd. Colbert wasn't smiling. Okay, he said, let's talk women's rights then. You oppose federal abortion guarantees. As a young woman, how do you defend that? Caroline's posture didn't shift. I believe life has value at every stage, and I also believe in empowering women with more than just the ability to terminate a pregnancy. How about helping them afford to keep the child? Supporting adoption reform? Offering workplace protections for mothers? Let's talk about those rights too. The audience quieted. The usual cheer that followed Colbert's jabs wasn't there. Stephen frowned just a little. And student loans, he offered, quicker this time. Do you oppose helping people crushed by debt? Caroline shook her head. No, I oppose pretending the answer is to hand universities blank checks while working-class Americans foot the bill. Reform the system, make universities accountable. Don't just move debt around like at a shell game. Some clapped. A few even nodded. Colbert noticed. He adjusted in his seat. All right, he said, voice sharper. Let's talk Jan 6. You worked in that administration. That day was chaos. Do you defend it? Caroline's gaze didn't waver. No, I condemn it. Violence has no place in politics. But I also believe one day shouldn't define millions of peaceful Americans who simply wanted a fair election process. We don't judge a movement by its worst moment. Unless we're playing politics. Colbert raised a finger. But it was political. Exactly, Caroline said, leaning forward. So let's talk about how to depoliticize truth, not weaponize outrage. We can start by not reducing our opponents to caricatures. Isn't that what this table is supposed to represent? The studio paused. Stephen reached for a sip of water. You talk about truth, he said more quietly, but your truth scares people. They hear your words and feel they're losing ground. Caroline nodded. Sometimes the truth does scare us, especially if we have only ever heard one side. But fear isn't a sign we're wrong, it's a sign we need to think harder. A long pause, she continued. Stephen, I didn't come here to be feared or applauded. I came here to speak clearly. If disagreement terrifies us, we're not living in a democracy. We're living in a bubble. This time the applause wasn't scripted. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Stephen set his note cards down. Okay, he said slowly. What do you believe your generation needs most right now? Caroline responded without missing a beat. Purpose, accountability, and the space to think without being told what's acceptable first. Stephen blinked. He wasn't used to answers without qualifiers. From the beginning, Colbert had been the ringmaster, but somewhere in this second act, the spotlight had stopped following him. Caroline's clarity had pierced through the lighting cues, the joke cards, the applause. The The audience, once waiting for her to fall, was now waiting for what she'd say next. Stephen sat back. "You're different than most of my guests," he said finally. Karoline smiled. "Or maybe I'm just prepared." The screen cut to commercial, but nobody exhaled. What happens when the punchline backfires? When the joke ends and the truth echoes? Karoline Leavitt didn't just survive Colbert's arena, she reclaimed it, one sentence at a time. As the third segment opened, Stephen Colbert glanced toward the camera with a half smile. Not the confident smirk from earlier, but something more guarded. His note cards remained untouched for several seconds. "We're back," he said, still joined by Karoline Leavitt, who is clearly not reading from anyone else's script. The audience chuckled lightly. Karoline offered a composed smile. "I find thinking for yourself tends to get you in trouble on both sides. I'm used to it." Colbert exhaled and leaned forward. "All right, let me ask you something bluntly," he said. "Do you ever wonder if you're being used, tokenized by a movement that doesn't always live up to its ideals?" The crowd stirred. This was supposed to be the knockout. But Karoline didn't blink. "I've heard that before," she replied calmly. "But isn't it interesting that the accusation of being used only comes when a woman, or a Gen Zer, or a minority steps outside the liberal script? No one ever asks progressive young voices if they're being used." The audience paused. Colbert furrowed his brow. Karoline continued, "I'm not here as a token. I'm here because I believe in something mine. And that belief didn't come from a party or a paycheck. It came from watching the promises of progressivism fail people I love. It came from watching censorship masquerade as compassion. And it came from watching politicians talk about unity while labeling half the country irredeemable." You could hear the tension in the room shift. Something in her mom, measured but resolute, made the room feel smaller. Colbert tried to rally. "But you can't deny," he said, "that many of the policies you support have real consequences. People losing healthcare access, environmental protections rolled back. Aren't those costs too high?" Karoline nodded. "Every policy has consequences. The question is, do we debate those consequences honestly, or do we moralize them so we can avoid debate altogether?" She leaned in, her voice soft but unwavering. "When someone like me speaks on these issues, I'm not denying anyone's humanity. I'm asking that my generation have the freedom to think out loud without being told we're traitors to our demographic." The camera cut briefly to audience members. Some now simply watching, no longer laughing. Colbert tried once more. "So what do you want from this moment? Why are you really here?" Karoline held his gaze. "Because I believe disagreement isn't the problem. It's the point. If young Americans can't see someone like me hold her ground here, they'll think they have to stay silent everywhere else. I want them to know they don't." Silence, then applause. It started tentatively, then grew. Colbert's face was unreadable. After a long moment, Colbert softened. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. Karoline smiled. "Neither are you." The exchange, intended to be a dismantling, had become a reckoning. Not of ideologies, but of assumptions. Colbert, known for his sharp edges, now looked across the desk at a guest who hadn't merely survived, she had flipped the entire format. As the segment ended, Colbert turned to the audience. "Well, folks, that was different." Laughter, some applause. Karoline stood and shook his hand again, this time without a smirk in sight. Clips from the interview dominated social media. But unlike usual late-night takedowns, these clips focused on Karoline's calm, her clarity, and the quiet power of her counterpunches. Headlines read, "Karoline Leavitt doesn't flinch. Colbert left searching for words." A Gen Z voice breaks through late-night noise. Not owned, not mocked, just heard. Progressive commentators acknowledge the moment. "You don't have to agree with her," one tweeted, "but she changed the tone. That matters." Young conservatives called it a masterclass in staying composed under fire. Media analysts noted a shift. Colbert's segment with Leavitt shows what late night could be if it stopped performing and started listening. In an age of shouting, Karoline had chosen calm. In a studio built for takedowns, she offered clarity. And where others would have bristled, she brought grace. Her appearance didn't just make headlines. it made a difference.